August 10, 1943, Camp Forest, Tennessee. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, an educated officer from Heidelberg, the camp library was a place of curiosity. He picked up a copy of the New York Times, fully expecting to find clumsy American propaganda he could laugh at. He held what he believed to be a tool of indoctrination, but he was about to discover it was a weapon of a completely different kind. His eyes scanned the front page, then froze. The headline was impossible. Senator Taft criticizes Roosevelt's wartime policies. Richter's mind raced. In the Third Reich, such a headline meant a death sentence for the editor. He looked around, expecting guards to rush in. But they were outside, casually smoking. Their indifference was the true shock. This wasn't a trick or a test. This was real. He was holding a document that should not exist in a nation at total war, a document that openly attacked its own commander-in-chief. Propaganda was meant to show unity and perfection. But this was a nation openly displaying its flaws to its enemies. What Richter held was not a weapon of steel, but of ideas, one his rigid ideology had no defense against. He didn't know it yet, but this single newspaper was the first crack in the fortress of his beliefs. This is the story of how the chaotic, uncensored truth of a free press became the most effective tool in the psychological demolition of Nazi soldiers, proving that the most powerful weapon isn't the one that hides the truth, but the one that isn't afraid of it. As Klaus Richter stared at the impossible headline in his hands, his mind recoiled, snapping back to the world he knew, a world where information was not a right, but a weapon, forged and controlled by one man, Dr. Joseph Goebbels. In Richter's Germany, truth was not discovered. It was manufactured in the halls of the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Goebbels, a master of mass psychology, operated on a simple but brutal principle he called the big lie, that a lie told often enough, with enough authority, becomes the people's reality. For over a decade, this principle had governed every word Richter had read, every broadcast he had heard, every film he had watched. It was the very air he breathed, designed to create a single, unified worldview, the Weltanschauung of the 1,000-year Reich. This control was absolute. The Reichspressekammer, or Reich Press Chamber, dictated the exact stories, headlines, and even the tone every newspaper in Germany was allowed to print. Thousands of publications were reduced to a single, monotonous voice. The radio, the most powerful tool of the regime, was centralized under the Reichsrundfunkgesellschaft. Listening to a foreign broadcast, like the BBC, was a crime of treason known as Wehrkraftzersetzung, undermining the war effort, an act punishable by imprisonment or death. To a man from this world, the concept of thousands of independent American newspapers, each with its own opinion, was not just foreign, it was a structural impossibility. It defied the very physics of a powerful, unified state as he understood it. The content of this monolithic truth machine was relentlessly consistent. It hammered home the myth of Aryan superiority and the invincibility of the Wehrmacht. It portrayed the Führer as a godlike visionary, and it painted a very specific picture of America. A decadent, chaotic, mongrel nation of mixed races, controlled by Jewish bankers, and teetering on the brink of economic and social collapse. They were told Americans were soft, undisciplined, and incapable of the sacrifice required for total war. This narrative was not a suggestion. It was the state, sanctioned reality, repeated daily until it was as ingrained as a prayer. The words Richter was now reading in the New York Times were not just a different opinion, they were a direct assault on the very foundation of his world, a foundation built on the terrifying certainty that there was only one truth, and that any other version was a lie worthy of death. The headline criticizing Roosevelt was a crack in the foundation of Klaus Richter's worldview, but a foundation built over a decade of relentless propaganda does not crumble in an instant. To understand this anomaly, he sought more information, acquiring a local newspaper circulated within the camp, the Tullahoma News. It wasn't a discussion of grand strategy or national sacrifice. It was a petty public argument between local citizens and their county commissioner about the paving of a rural road. Two farmers were openly challenging an elected official, their angry words printed for all to see. To Richter, a product of the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle of absolute obedience, this was a portrait of a nation in disarray. A society that allowed such public bickering over trivial matters lacked the discipline, the unity of will necessary for total war. That night, Richter wrote in his hidden diary, not with awe, but with a renewed sense of confidence. "The propaganda was right, just not in the way I thought," he wrote. "This nation is not a monolith of steel. It is a noisy bazaar of squabbling merchants and petty politicians. There is no central will, no discipline. They are a rope of sand. How can such people possibly win this war?" He didn't realize it yet, but he was misinterpreting the evidence. He was seeing the symptoms of freedom, but diagnosing them as the disease of weakness. This initial miscalculation was a crucial step in his psychological demolition, a foundation of contempt that would make the revelations to come even more shattering. Klaus Richter's initial diagnosis of America as a rope of sand was a comforting thought, a way to fit this new, confusing reality into his rigid Nazi worldview. The local Tennessee newspaper, he concluded, must be an anomaly, a small pocket of rural dissent. But this intellectual armor began to crack as the camp library's exchange program brought in newspapers from across the nation. Soon, he wasn't just holding the Tullahoma News. He was holding the Chicago Tribune, the St. Louis Post, Dispatch, even the Boston Globe. He spread them out on the wooden table, a map of a nation that, to him, seemed to be at war not only with Germany and Japan, but also with itself. This was his first true glimpse into the shocking reality of a free press. He began a small project, comparing how different papers covered the exact same event. A naval battle in the Pacific was reported in one paper as a strategic triumph, while another lamented the heavy price of victory in an editorial. A third paper published a column from a famous journalist who questioned the admiral's strategy altogether. For Richter, this was madness. In Germany, a military victory was reported in every single newspaper, with the exact same triumphant words, issued directly from Goebbels' ministry. Here, victory itself was a subject for debate. He learned that in 1943 there were over 1,750 different daily newspapers and thousands more weekly publications operating across the United States. It wasn't one voice singing out of tune. It was a choir of millions, each singing their own song, somehow creating a cacophony that was moving a nation forward. He desperately searched for the official government line, the real story, but soon came to the horrifying realization that there wasn't one. This discovery triggered a profound intellectual crisis in Richter's mind. His entire upbringing was based on the principle of a single, unified national will. The Nazi model was simple and, to him, logical. The state determines the truth, and the people follow. This created strength and focus. The American model seemed to be the exact opposite. The people argued endlessly, creating 1,000 different truths, and the state somehow had to function amidst this noise. He saw syndicated columnists whose opinions were printed in hundreds of papers, openly disagreeing with each other and with the president. How could a nation effectively wage a war when its own newspapers were providing ammunition to its critics and, by extension, its enemies? The system was, by his definition, fundamentally broken, chaotic, and inefficient. But as the weeks turned into months, a new, far more dangerous question began to form in his mind, a question he barely dared to write in his diary. He had seen the endless columns of American tanks in Africa. He had witnessed the impossible logistics of the American military. He knew they were not weak. So if this nation was undeniably strong, but its press was undeniably chaotic, then his core assumption had to be wrong. The question that began to haunt him was no longer, how can these fools win? It was a question that struck at the very heart of his ideology. What if this chaos isn't a weakness? What if this freedom to argue, to criticize, to be divided, what if that is the actual source of their power? The dangerous question that had taken root in Klaus Richter's mind, the idea that American chaos might be a form of strength, was an intellectual puzzle he felt compelled to solve. He began to search the newspapers not for simple contradictions, but for proof of the systemic collapse that Dr. Goebbels had assured every German was imminent in the United States. He focused on the economy, the engine of any war machine, certain he would find evidence of the rot within. He found it, but what he discovered was a truth far more shocking and paradoxical than the propaganda he had been fed. He read about thousands of American coal miners going on strike, demanding higher wages and better conditions from the very government that was fighting a global war. For Richter, this was the ultimate act of treason. In Nazi Germany, the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, or German Labour Front, had absorbed all unions into a single state-controlled entity. A strike was not a labour dispute. It was a stab in the back of every soldier at the front, an act of defiance against the Führer himself, punishable by immediate and brutal retribution. Yet here, in the heart of America, he was reading about work stoppages that had halted the production of millions of tons of coal needed for the war effort. The newspapers didn't hide it. They reported it openly, with some editorials supporting the miners and others condemning them. Historical records show that 1943 was one of the most contentious years in American labor history, with nearly 14 million man-days lost to strikes. To Richter, this wasn't just chaos, it was national suicide. This, he thought with a flicker of hope, was the proof of the internal collapse he had been looking for. But then, through the camp library, he encountered an even greater paradox, a piece of American culture that defied all logic, a celebrated novel called The Grapes of Wrath. He managed to acquire a German-translated copy intended for the reeducation program. As he read John Steinbeck's brutal depiction of poverty, displacement, and the failures of the American dream during the Great Depression, he was stunned. This was not a book that celebrated America. It was a book that put its soul on trial, exposing its deepest wounds for all to see. In Germany, a book like this would have been burned in a public square, its author exiled or executed as an enemy of the state. But in America, it had won the Pulitzer Prize. It was a national bestseller. They had even turned it into a major Hollywood film that was shown around the world. That night, Richter's diary entry was a testament to his complete cognitive dissonance. He read editorials that didn't just question Roosevelt's policies but attacked the man himself, calling him a would-be dictator, a warmonger who had tricked his nation into a conflict it didn't need. He saw political cartoons depicting his own Führer and the American president as two sides of the same authoritarian coin. To Richter, who had sworn a blood oath of personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler, this was beyond comprehension. In Germany, the Führerprinzip established that the leader's will was the nation's will. To criticize the Führer was to attack the very soul of Germany itself. Here, attacking the president seemed to be a national pastime, a right exercised with brutal enthusiasm by his political opponents, even as American soldiers were dying overseas under that same president's command. This wasn't just dissent. This was, in his eyes, a nation gleefully committing ideological suicide in broad daylight for the entire world to see. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. As he followed the news through late 1943 and into 1944, he learned of something that was, to his totalitarian-trained mind, the ultimate act of insanity. He learned that America was preparing to hold a full, contested presidential election in November 1944. This was the wow fact that no amount of propaganda could explain away. The concept was staggering. In the midst of the largest war in human history, with the invasions of Europe and the Pacific reaching their bloody crescendo, the American people would be given the choice to fire their commander-in-chief and hire a new one. Roosevelt would have to pause from directing global strategy to campaign against a rival, Thomas Dewey, who would publicly declare that the president was incompetent and that he could win the war better. For Richter, whose own leader ruled by acclamation in staged 99% approval referendums, this democratic process was not a feature, it was a fatal design flaw. That evening, as he tried to document his thoughts, the neat confidence of his earlier diary entries was gone, replaced by the frantic scribblings of a man whose intellectual universe had been turned inside out. The strikes, the local political squabbles, the racial arguments, they all now made a terrifying kind of sense. They weren't random acts of chaos. They were the symptoms of a system built on the very principle of conflict. He realized with a chilling certainty that the unity he had prized so highly was a brittle facade, enforced by fear. The Americans, however, derived their strength from the chaos itself. His pen hovered over the page as he wrote the most treasonous thought of his life. We are not fighting a nation of weak-willed merchants. We are fighting a storm, an idea that feeds on disagreement and grows stronger from internal conflict. By every law of logic, they should have collapsed long ago. The fact that they have not, the fact that they are thriving, means our own foundation is a lie. We have not just misjudged our enemy, we have misunderstood the very nature of power, and we have already lost. Having witnessed the crumbling of his beliefs in economic and political unity, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter now turned his analytical gaze to the final, most sacred pillar of his Nazi worldview, the ideology of racial purity. For years he had been taught that a nation's strength was a direct product of its racial homogeneity. Goebbels' propaganda had relentlessly hammered home the idea that America, a mongrel nation of mixed races, was inherently degenerate, chaotic, and biologically incapable of greatness. Now, protected by the quiet anonymity of the camp library, Richter began to search the American newspapers for evidence of this racial rot, certain that here, at last, he would find the ultimate, undeniable proof of American weakness. At first, what he found seemed to confirm everything he had been taught. He read shocking reports about the rigid system of Jim Crow segregation in the southern states, where black Americans were treated as second-class citizens. He read about lynchings, about simmering racial tensions in northern industrial cities, and about the violent race riot that had erupted in Detroit in June of 1943, a conflict that required federal troops to restore order. From Richter's perspective, this was the ultimate proof. The propaganda was true. This nation was not unified. It was a society at war with itself, torn apart by the very racial impurity that the Third Reich sought to eliminate. To his mind, a nation so internally fractured along racial lines could never triumph. It was a biological and sociological impossibility. This internal decay, he thought, was the fatal weakness that would inevitably lead to America's collapse, regardless of how many tanks or planes it produced. But as he read further, he stumbled upon the most profound and destabilizing paradox of all. Alongside the articles detailing the horrors of racism, he found editorials, columns, and letters from American citizens, both black and white, fiercely condemning it. He learned of a movement within the African American community called the Double V Campaign, a patriotic call for a double victory: victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. He read the words of black leaders demanding that America live up to its own creed that all men are created equal. The ultimate shock for Richter was not the existence of racism in America. The shock was the existence of a loud, vibrant, and patriotic anti-racist movement that was openly challenging the nation's conscience in the middle of a global war. In Germany, any such discussion would be silenced with a bullet. Here, it was printed on the front pages. That realization was the final, devastating blow. The entire Nazi ideology was built on the foundational lie that racial purity was the source of national strength. But the evidence in front of him was irrefutable. Here was America, the most racially diverse, conflicted, and self-critical nation on Earth, and it was simultaneously producing a level of industrial and military power that was crushing the racially pure Aryan Reich. The theory was not just wrong, it was a catastrophic fantasy. That night, Richter wrote a final, simple entry in his diary before closing it for weeks. "Everything we believe is a lie," he wrote. "Strength does not come from purity. It does not come from silence. I no longer know where it comes from, but I know with absolute certainty where it does not." The central pillar of his worldview, the very bedrock of his identity as a soldier of the Reich, had been pulverized by the chaotic, contradictory, and brutally honest pages of a free American newspaper. With the pillars of his political and racial ideology shattered, Klaus Richter was now an observer adrift in a sea of incomprehensible truths. He believed he had witnessed the full extent of American paradoxes, but there was one final sanctuary for his pride as a soldier: the myth of the Wehrmacht's professional superiority. In Germany, military matters were sacred and secret. Defeats were never acknowledged, losses were hidden, and the high command was portrayed as infallible. He now turned to the American newspapers to see how they reported on their own military, expecting to find, at last, the familiar bombast of state propaganda glorifying its soldiers. What he discovered was perhaps the most profound shock of all. The American press did not hide its military failures. It reported on them in painstaking, often brutal detail. He read accounts from the grueling Italian campaign, where progress was measured in bloody yards and casualties were high. He saw maps that didn't just show arrows of triumphant advance but also highlighted areas of stalemate. He read articles quoting ordinary soldiers who spoke not of glory, but of fear, exhaustion, and the grim reality of combat. Most shockingly, he found long, somber lists of local men who were reported as killed or missing in action, their names and hometowns printed for all to see. This was the final, unthinkable weapon: transparency. The American government wasn't just allowing criticism of its leaders, it was admitting its own military setbacks to its people in the midst of the war. Richter understood the devastating impact this would have in Germany. Such news would shatter civilian morale and be seen as a catastrophic failure of leadership. But here, it seemed to have the opposite effect. This brutal honesty created a bond of shared sacrifice and trust between the front lines and the home front. It treated the American people not as children to be fooled with fairy tales of endless victory, but as adults who could handle the truth. He finally understood. The strength of the Reich was a brittle facade, dependent on a constant stream of lies. One significant defeat, if ever admitted, could shatter the entire illusion. America's strength, however, was resilient and forged in the fires of open debate and painful honesty. It was a nation that vaccinated itself against the shock of failure by acknowledging it, learning from it, and openly mourning its losses. Having accepted the painful truth about his own government's military failures, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter clung to one final pillar of his identity. He had seen that America's system was not what he was told, but he still believed in the unwavering, monolithic unity of the German soldier. He believed that while Americans might be a chaotic mix of dissenters, true Germans, especially the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, were bound by a sacred, unbreakable loyalty to the Führer and the fatherland. He saw any German who thought otherwise as a traitor, a communist, or a weakling who did not represent the true spirit of his people. It was this last, desperate belief that was about to face its most intimate and devastating challenge. One afternoon in the camp library, he came across a new publication, one that was different from the American papers. It was printed not in English, but in perfect intellectual German, with a quality of writing that was both familiar and shocking. It was a newspaper published not in New York or Chicago, but right here, within the American prison camp system. It was written by German prisoners, for German prisoners. He had discovered Der Ruf, the call. This was no simple camp newsletter with sports scores and work schedules. This was a high-level political and literary journal, filled with sophisticated essays and searing editorials. As Richter read, a feeling of cold dread washed over him. The articles openly discussed the concept of German collective guilt in the crimes of the Nazi regime. They featured critiques of the German militarism that had led the nation into 2 world wars. Most shockingly, they laid out detailed plans and philosophical arguments for the democratic reconstruction of a post-Nazi Germany. The writers were not arguing for an American victory, they were arguing for the soul of Germany itself, calling on their fellow prisoners to reject the ideology that had led them to ruin. This was not the voice of the American enemy, this was the voice of a German intellectual and cultural rebellion happening right inside the wire of a POW camp in the middle of Tennessee. This was no accident. Richter would later learn that Der Ruf was the cornerstone of a highly sophisticated American reeducation program, which sought to identify anti-Nazi intellectuals among the prisoners and give them a platform. Its editors, men like Alfred Andersch and Hans Werner Richter, were not fringe outcasts. They were decorated soldiers and respected writers who had turned against the regime. The Americans had understood a crucial psychological truth. The message of democracy would be infinitely more powerful if it came not from a foreign guard, but from a fellow German who had worn the same uniform and faced the same hardships. For Richter, the realization that his enemy understood the psychology of his own people better than his own leaders did was a profound and humiliating shock. That night, his diary entry was not one of intellectual curiosity, but of deep personal anguish. This was not an argument with a foreign power. This was a civil war happening within his own soul. "These men in Der Ruf," he wrote, They are not Americans. They are us. They speak our language. They know our poetry. They fought in our battles. And yet, they say everything we have fought for is a lie. They call it our duty to betray our oaths. He felt a surge of rage, the instinct to brand them as traitors. But he could not dismiss their arguments so easily. Their logic was sharp, their love for Germany undeniable. For the first time, a terrifying question pierced through his anger. Who is the real traitor? The soldier who sees the truth of our nation's crimes and speaks it, or the one who continues to fight blindly for the lie? The discovery of dissent among his own countrymen was a wound to Klaus Richter's soul. He was no longer just a soldier of the Reich, he was a man forced to question the very definition of loyalty. In this state of profound confusion, he turned to the one connection he had left to his old world, a letter to his wife in Berlin. In the Wehrmacht, writing home was a duty bound by unspoken rules. Letters were expected to be confident, full of fighting spirit, and loyal to the Führer, small pieces of personal propaganda to boost morale on the home front. Every letter was subject to review by a company officer to ensure it met this standard. Richter expected the Americans to have a similar, if not stricter, system. He sat with the blank page before him, determined to write a letter that would pass the American censor, but an even more formidable censor stood in his way. The truth he now carried. The American mail censorship operation was another example of its industrial might, a system of staggering scale. At secret facilities like P.O. Box 1142 at Fort Hunt, Virginia, over 10,000 personnel, many of them German-born Jewish refugees who understood the nuances of the language, read and analyzed millions of letters from prisoners of war. Their primary goal was not to enforce ideological purity, but to gather military and strategic intelligence. Historical records show they processed up to 1 million letters a month. This army of censors read tales of love, despair, and boredom, searching for hidden codes or details about troop morale. But the great irony was that for prisoners like Richter, the American censor was the least of their worries. The true prison was the reality of the world they had left behind. How could he begin to describe his new reality? If he wrote that he spent his afternoons reading uncensored newspapers in a library, his wife would think he was losing his mind. If he described the camp meals, with their daily rations of meat and fresh milk, it would be an act of unimaginable cruelty to a family living on watery soup and bread rations in a bombed-out city. He came to a horrifying realization. Telling the truth was a danger not to himself, but to his family. Every piece of mail arriving in Germany was scrutinized by the Gestapo. A letter that even hinted at American prosperity or democratic freedoms could be seen as treasonous propaganda, leading to the arrest and interrogation of his wife and parents. He was trapped. The Americans had given him access to the truth, but his own government had made it a crime to share it. So, he wrote a lie. He dipped his pen in ink and wrote the same empty pleasantries he had been taught to write for years. He wrote that his morale was high, that his faith in the final victory was unshaken, and that he thought of her and the fatherland every day. He wrote the words of a loyal Nazi officer, even as the beliefs behind them had turned to ash in his mind. He sealed the envelope, feeling a sense of profound and crushing isolation. The barbed wire of Camp Forest kept his body in America, but the truth he now knew had erected a far more painful wall between him and the woman he loved. That night, he wrote in his diary, "Today I wrote to my wife. I told her I was well. I did not tell her that I am a ghost, trapped between a world that is a lie and another that I can never truly be a part of. The American censor will read my meaningless words, but the true prison is the truth that I could not write." The discovery of dissent among his own countrymen was a wound to Klaus Richter's soul. He was no longer just a soldier of the Reich. He was a man forced to question the very definition of loyalty. In this state of profound confusion, he turned to the one connection he had left to his old world, a letter to his wife in Berlin. In the Wehrmacht, writing home was a duty bound by unspoken rules. Letters were expected to be confident, full of fighting spirit, and loyal to the Führer, small pieces of personal propaganda to boost morale on the home front. Every letter was subject to review by a company officer to ensure it met this standard. Richter expected the Americans to have a similar, if not stricter, system. He sat with the blank page before him, determined to write a letter that would pass the American censor, but an even more formidable censor stood in his way: the truth he now carried. The American mail censorship operation was another example of its industrial might, a system of staggering scale. At secret facilities like P.O. Box 1142 at Fort Hunt, Virginia, over 10,000 personnel read and analyzed millions of letters from prisoners of war. Crucially, many of these multilingual staff were German Jewish refugees who had escaped the very regime Richter served. They now found themselves in the surreal position of reading the private thoughts of their former oppressors. Their task was immense, not just a hunt for military secrets, but to build a vast psychological profile of the German soldier, to understand his hopes, his fears, and the slow erosion of his morale. This army of censors read tales of love, despair, and boredom. But the great irony was that for prisoners like Richter, the American censor was the least of their worries. The true prison was the reality of the world they had left behind, a world where the truth itself was a crime. Richter picked up his pen, then stopped. How could he begin to describe his new reality? He thought about describing the camp library, with its uncensored books and newspapers, then imagined the Nazi block warden reading the letter to his wife. How could he explain access to the truth in a way that didn't sound like a coded message or a sign of his own treason? He considered mentioning the sheer quantity of food, the fresh milk, the meat served daily, but the words felt like a physical blow, an act of unimaginable cruelty against the very people he loved, who were surviving on rations in a bombed-out city. He realized with a chilling certainty that telling the simple, objective truth would actively endanger them. Every piece of mail arriving in Germany was scrutinized by the Gestapo. A letter that even hinted at American prosperity or democratic freedoms could be seen as enemy propaganda, leading to the arrest and interrogation of his entire family. So, he wrote a lie. He dipped his pen and wrote the same empty pleasantries he had been taught to write for years. He wrote that his morale was high, that his faith in the final victory was unshaken, and that he thought of her and the fatherland every day. He wrote the words of a loyal Nazi officer, even as the beliefs behind them had turned to ash in his mind. He sealed the envelope, feeling a sense of profound and crushing isolation. The barbed wire of Camp Forest kept his body in America, but the truth he now knew had erected a far more painful wall between him and the woman he loved. That night he wrote in his diary, "Today I wrote to my wife. I told her I was well. I did not tell her that I am a ghost, trapped between a world that is a lie and another I can never truly be part of. The American censor will read my meaningless words, but the true prison is the truth that I could not write, a truth that would have liberated my mind but condemned my family." The profound isolation Klaus Richter felt after writing to his wife was a new kind of imprisonment. He had accepted the shocking truths about America's political, economic, and social realities, but he couldn't shake a nagging question. Was it all just an accident? Was the access to libraries, the uncensored newspapers, and the emergence of anti-Nazi publications like Der Ruf simply the byproducts of a chaotic democratic system? Or was there a hidden design, a deliberate strategy at play that he couldn't see? He had been trained to see conspiracy and control in everything, but the sheer openness of the American system was a perfect camouflage. He began to suspect that the most effective cage was the one that its prisoner didn't know he was in. The truth, when he finally discovered it, was more sophisticated and brilliant than he could have ever imagined. What Richter and the vast majority of German prisoners never knew was that they were the subjects of one of the largest and most ambitious psychological warfare programs in modern history. The events that seemed random were, in fact, carefully orchestrated components of a secret American strategy run by the Provost Marshal General's Office, specifically its Special Projects Division. This was not a crude brainwashing program. Its goal was far more ambitious: the re-education of the German mind. American leadership, looking beyond the end of the war, had asked a critical question. How do you ensure that a defeated Germany does not simply plant the seeds for a Third World War? The answer was to identify and empower a new generation of German leaders from within the POW camps who could rebuild their nation on a democratic foundation. The camp libraries, the university courses, the access to a free press, and the quiet support for anti-Nazi prisoner publications like Der Ruf were all calculated moves in this grand intellectual chess game. The most shocking wow factor of this secret program was not the plan itself, but the architects behind it. The strategy was designed and often implemented by a group the Third Reich had foolishly cast out: German, American academics and social scientists, many of them German Jews who had been forced to flee for their lives. Intellectual giants who had escaped Hitler's tyranny were now using their intimate understanding of the German psyche to systematically dismantle the Nazi ideology from thousands of miles away. They understood that direct, forceful propaganda would fail. Instead, they adopted a clinical, patient approach based on the emerging field of social psychology. Their strategy was simple: don't tell the prisoners what to think. Instead, create a controlled environment where they are given the tools, the facts, the uncensored news, the opposing viewpoints to deconstruct their own lies. When Richter finally learned of this program through a camp informant, his transformation was complete. It was a moment of ultimate intellectual surrender. The rage and confusion were replaced by a cold, grudging, and profound sense of awe. He and his comrades believed they were fighting a two-dimensional war of tanks and planes, but the Americans were fighting a third, invisible war, a war of ideas, of psychology, a war for the future of Germany itself. They weren't just conquering territory, they were meticulously reshaping the minds of their captives. That night, Richter wrote in his diary for the first time in weeks. "Today I learned the truth. Nothing here is an accident. They have been studying us, understanding us, and patiently guiding us toward a new way of thinking. They are not just trying to defeat our armies, they are trying to cure our nation's soul. This is a level of strategic thinking we never imagined. This is how a true superpower wages war." By the winter of 1943, the relentless assault of American reality had achieved its goal. The atmosphere in the prisoner of war camps had fundamentally changed. The loud, arrogant debates in the mess halls about German superiority faded into a somber, questioning silence. A silence filled not with the discipline of soldiers, but with the heavy weight of doubt. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter observed that even the most fanatical Nazi officers in his barracks no longer spoke of final victory. They had stopped defending the indefensible. The constant, undeniable evidence of American freedom had acted like a slow, corrosive acid, dissolving their iron certainty. They had, as one American intelligence officer noted, simply seen too much. This phenomenon was so widespread that it was given a name by American psychologists: ideological collapse syndrome. It was the complete and often painful disintegration of a core belief system when confronted with overwhelming contradictory truths. The symptoms were clear. Prisoners who had once burned American magazines now lined up at the camp library. They requested the very newspapers they had previously dismissed as propaganda, now consumed by an insatiable thirst for the truth, no matter how bitter its taste. They were no longer fighting the information, they were trying to understand the full scale of the lies they were told. Richter saw this transformation in himself. The anger and contempt vanished, replaced by a mournful clarity. He looked at the faces of his fellow prisoners and no longer saw soldiers of a master race, but a generation of lost men, betrayed by the leaders they had sworn to die for. His diary was no longer filled with observations about America's strangeness, but with agonizing questions about Germany's future. He had stopped defending the Reich. He was now trying to save what was left of Germany from the ruins of the Nazi dream. The old world, with its simple certainties and glorious lies, was dead. The ideological demolition was complete. The ground had been cleared, but the future was a terrifying, empty space. For Richter and thousands like him, the final, most important question remained: after the fall of the Reich, what would rise from the ashes? The collapse of their old world had left Klaus Richter and thousands of his fellow prisoners in a state of quiet, intellectual limbo. They had been stripped of their political, economic, and racial certainties, and were now grappling with the terrifying freedom of thought. They had learned, through painful deconstruction, to trust the chaotic but honest voice of the American press. They were now receptive to the truth, no matter how unsettling, but they were completely unprepared for the final, soul-shattering truth that was about to be revealed. a truth so monstrous it would make all their previous shocks about industry and ideology seem trivial. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into the heart of Germany, a new set of names began to appear in the camp newspapers, names that would be forever burned into the conscience of humanity: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The articles were accompanied by photographs, images so horrific, so profoundly evil, that the prisoners' first, unified reaction was instinctive denial. "Atrocity propaganda," the men shouted in the barracks. "A final, desperate lie to break our spirit." For weeks, this was the consensus. They believed it was a trick, a cynical psychological operation. After all, they were soldiers of the honorable Wehrmacht. They had fought for the fatherland, not for monsters. They reasoned that no nation, not even one as ruthless as their leaders professed to be, was capable of such organized industrial-scale murder. But then, the evidence became an inescapable flood. The camp authorities began showing them the official newsreel footage, the same films being shown to horrified civilians in America and Britain. They saw it with their own eyes: the skeletal survivors, the walking dead, the mountains of emaciated corpses being bulldozed into mass graves. They saw the faces of the American soldiers, young men who had seen the worst of combat, recoiling in horror and disbelief. Then came the final confirmation, the one they could not deny: letters from their own families in Germany. In hushed, terrified tones, their wives and parents wrote about the unbelievable things being discovered in camps just miles from their homes. The denial shattered, replaced by a silence born of absolute horror. This was not a military or an ideological defeat. It was a moral collapse. The last shred of pride they held the honor of the German soldier was obliterated. They were not just soldiers on the losing side of a war. They were the unwitting accomplices and armed guards of a criminal regime engaged in the greatest crime in human history. That night, Richter wrote a final, tear-stained entry. "We thought we were warriors. We discovered we were the watchmen for a slaughterhouse. All this time, we were shocked by America's strength. Today, we are shocked by Germany's evil. The war is not just lost. Our honor is lost with it. We are not just defeated. We are damned." The revelation of the Holocaust was the final, agonizing death of the old Germany. For Klaus Richter and the hundreds of thousands of his countrymen in American captivity, all that remained was the profound shame of their service and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. Between 1945 and 1946, they were repatriated, sent back across the Atlantic. They were returning to a nation that existed only as a ghost, a landscape of rubble, ruin, and starvation, divided and occupied by the very powers they had been told were inferior. But these were not the same men who had left Africa in chains 2 years earlier. They were physically healthier, yet their minds bore the scars of a shattered worldview. They were returning to a broken homeland, but they carried with them something precious and entirely unexpected: the blueprint for its rebirth. They became America's unwitting ambassadors of democracy, the most effective agents of transformation. When they spoke of a different way, their countrymen listened, because they were not foreign occupiers. They were sons, brothers, and husbands who had seen the other side with their own eyes. They had witnessed the awesome power of a free press and the strength of a nation that was not afraid to criticize itself. They understood that America's true might came not from a single dictatorial will, but from the chaotic, creative energy of millions of free people pursuing their own prosperity. They had seen a future that worked, and they were now determined to build it from the ashes of their past. Many of these former prisoners rose to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction, becoming the architects of the new democratic state. Walter Hallstein, who taught law classes to his fellow prisoners at Camp Como, Mississippi, became the first president of the European Commission, a key founder of European unity. Hans Kroll, a prisoner at Camp Shelby, was appointed as West Germany's ambassador to the United States, tasked with rebuilding the bridge between the two former enemies. Others became captains of industry, champions of agricultural reform, and founders of new, independent newspapers, each applying the lessons they had learned in American captivity. They championed a free press, knowing its power to hold leaders accountable. They built a consumer economy, having witnessed its ability to create stability and wealth for all, not just the elite. The German Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that saw West Germany rise from the rubble to become an economic superpower in the 1950 seconds, was built in part on the lessons learned in American prison camps. As Hans Kroll would later write, "We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. We saw that democracy created wealth. These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped the new Germany." The journey of Oberleutnant Klaus Richter and the thousands of prisoners like him was a passage through the looking glass. They had arrived in America as true believers, convinced of their own ideological and racial superiority, expecting to find a weak, divided nation on the verge of collapse. They left as witnesses to a profound and unsettling truth, that the very things their Nazi ideology had labeled as fatal weaknesses, a free press, political dissent, economic arguments, and racial strife were, in fact, the chaotic, messy, and undeniable sources of America's true power. They had been sent to conquer a nation but had instead been conquered by an idea. The Third Reich was a monument of steel built on a foundation of sand. It demanded absolute unity, but this unity was brittle, enforced by the Gestapo's terror and Goebbels' lies. It projected an image of perfect, unwavering strength, but it was a strength that could not withstand the slightest crack of doubt or dissent. America, they discovered, was the opposite. It was not a perfect monument, but a raging, chaotic storm of competing ideas and conflicting truths. It was a nation that put its flaws on the front page for all to see, a nation strong enough to not only tolerate dissent, but to see it as a vital part of its existence. The Germans had believed that a nation at war with itself could not possibly win a war against others. They were wrong. They learned that a nation that constantly wrestled with its own conscience was infinitely more resilient than one that had silenced it entirely. The ultimate secret weapon in America's arsenal was never a tank, a plane, or even the atomic bomb. It was the First Amendment. It was the messy, inefficient, but unbreakable power of a free society to self-correct. The most powerful form of propaganda, they learned, was no propaganda at all, just the raw, uncensored, and often ugly truth. The lies that had so shocked Klaus Richter in the American newspapers, the criticism of the president, the reports of strikes, the admission of military setbacks were, in the end, the ultimate proof of a nation's confidence. Their transformation was now complete. They had arrived believing that the truth was whatever the state decreed it to be. They returned to Germany understanding that the state is strongest when it is held accountable by the truth. They had learned that the most dangerous lies were not the ones they were allowed to read in the American newspapers, but the ones they had been forced to believe their entire lives. The journey of Klaus Richter and the thousands of prisoners like him was a passage through the looking glass. They had arrived in America as true believers, convinced of their own ideological superiority, expecting to find a nation weakened by its chaotic freedoms. They left as witnesses to a profound and unsettling truth, that the very things their Nazi ideology had labeled as fatal weaknesses, a free press, political dissent, and open self-criticism were, in fact, the messy and undeniable sources of America's true power. They had learned that a nation's strength is not measured by the quiet perfection of its propaganda, but by its loud, chaotic, and brutal honesty with itself. The ultimate secret weapon in America's arsenal was never a tank or a plane. It was the First Amendment. It was the freedom to confront uncomfortable truths. They had learned that the most dangerous lies were not the ones they were allowed to read in the American newspapers, but the ones they had been forced to believe their entire lives. This is a story you can find in history books, but the most powerful stories are often hidden in our own families. World War II changed the lives of millions forever. Is there a similar story in your family's past? A story of a soldier, a prisoner, or an ordinary person from that era who witnessed something extraordinary? Please, share a piece of your family's history in the comments below, so we can all understand this time a little better, together. And if you don't have a personal story, I'd love to know your thoughts on the big idea of this video. Is a nation's true strength found in hiding its flaws, or in the freedom to confront them? If you enjoy deep historical stories like this, join us on this journey. Subscribe to the channel and become a part of this community. Thank you for watching.